Michelle Thompson. If you don't know me, if we haven't met already, I took this job as a certified local government coordinator at the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, or DAHP. I took it over from Kim Gant just about a year ago. And since then, I've been really trying to pay a lot of attention to these common questions that I get from CLG Commission members. I get a lot of the same questions, and I just wanted to take some time to address some of those. I thought everybody could kind of use a CLG 101 and an overview of all of the questions that you asked me. So I tried to include as much as I could without overwhelming you with this amount of information, but just kind of, the stuff that I really want you to know about the CLG program. So I said this a minute ago, but every year I'm planning on holding 4 fundamental Zoom trainings on a consistent schedule. And my plan for that is that it will be CLG 101, just like the one we're doing today, one on adding to your local register, one on design review, and then one on special valuation and financial incentives. So I'm going to record them. I'll have time for Q&A at the end of each one of those trainings. And the hope for this is kind of twofold. So I'm hoping that it will give existing commission members the opportunity to review, refresh a lot of the information that they already know, but it will also be helpful for new commission members so that they can get some of the fundamentals of the training for the CLG program. So it's not all on the burden of the commission to do the training. So I'll have my phone number and email on the last slide. Write it down if you don't already have it. Call me, email me anytime you have questions, you want to talk about something, you want something clarified, you want me to come to your town and do a very specialized training, whatever you need, let me know. That's what I'm here for. So as I said, we're going to begin with a CLG 101 training today. We're going to cover just a lot of broad basics, an overview, time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions that you think of during the presentation, just go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll look at them and I'll address them when I get to the end and we do our Q&A. Okay, so like I said, I know a lot of you. I know a lot of you over Zoom. I've actually met at least a couple of you in person. I just met Lisa from Walla Walla last week when I was in Chelan for a conference. So a quick about me. So I've spent most of my life in Washington State, mainly in Olympia. I've also lived in Pullman. I've lived in Seattle. I've lived in Cheney, Spokane. My husband's from Spokane. My family goes back generations in Washington State. My ancestors were mainly farmers on the east side and loggers on the west side. I have a profound love of old buildings and places. I always have. I'm working on trying to explain this or express this better, why that is. It's just one of those things that people either get or they don't. I don't think I need to explain that to any of you in this room. I think you clearly get it, or you wouldn't be here. So I'm a first generation college graduate. I have a degree in interior design from Spokane Falls Community College. I have a BA in art history from EWU in Cheney. And I have a master's in historic preservation from Clemson University in Charleston, South Carolina. So when I finished grad school in Charleston, my husband and I moved to Charlottesville, Virginia. And there I got my first professional job in preservation, and I worked as a landscape and architectural historian for a small firm. I did a lot of work for the National Park Service there, a lot of reports for places like the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park in Atlanta, Teddy Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. I did a report about a dude ranch there. Got to do a lot of stuff. While I was doing that for a time. I also worked at historic sites in Virginia. I worked as a tour guide. I worked as general staff. I'd kind of anything and everything to be near history. Living in Virginia was kind of a dream come true in that area for me. So that's me in the bottom corner. Obviously, that black and white photo, that's when I briefly worked at Monticello. You can see a cemetery in the grave in the background. That's when they were painting the wrought iron fence around the Jefferson family cemetery. My job for that week was making sure that visitors didn't run into the paint at the Jefferson family cemetery. We called it the graveyard shift. So I've done, there's just some photos on the screen of different things I've been involved with and done in different places. After we left Virginia, we lived in Boise for a little while. I had my own business there as a historic preservation consultant. What I did basically as a historic preservation consultant for certified local governments, when you hire consultants to do like a survey or a preservation plan, design guidelines, that's the kind of stuff that I was doing when I was in Idaho, and I actually still consult in Idaho a little bit since it's a different state. There's no conflict of interest, so sometimes I actually do a little bit of CLG consultation there, which is really fun. So just over a year ago, I got hired by DAHP, Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. My husband, Ben, and I moved back to Olympia. I'm never leaving again. I love Washington. I had a great time living other places and doing other things, so I'm happy to be back here. Being a historic preservationist is not just a job for me. It's literally who I am. It's the one subject that I never lose any interest in. It's one of those things that the more I do it, the more I'm interested in. So I'm lucky. I'm really lucky to have found that. So to start our training, I told you this was going to be really broad. I'm going to give you some context about the history of historic preservation in the United States. So many of you are probably well aware of this, but by the middle of the 20th century, a lot of American cities were in bad shape and they were suffering from crumbling infrastructure. To remedy the problem, the federal government undertook massive wholesale demolition of historic buildings. Whole city blocks were erased, right? Downtowns, practices commonly referred to as urban renewal. So a lot of people were shocked and sad that we were losing so many historic buildings at such an alarming. Can somebody mute whoever? I can hear somebody in the background. Can you all make sure that you mute? Thank you. So long story short, as a response to this, in 1966, something called the National Historic Preservation Act was signed into law. The National Historic Preservation Act was and still is the single most effective federal law aimed at protecting historic buildings ever passed in the United States. So the National Historic Preservation Act did several things. It established the Historic Preservation Program at the federal level, and that's administered by the National Park Service. A lot of times you'll see National Park Service logos on preservation-related stuff. That's why. The Act created the National Register of Historic Places. That's also administered by the National Park Service. It required each state to establish something called the State Historic Preservation Office. We often refer to that as SHPO, S-H-P-O. In Washington, the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, is the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, or DAHP, where I work. In 1980, an amendment was made to the National Historic Preservation Act, and it required that each SHPO establish something called a Certified Local Government Program. And finally, this is not everything that the Act did, but this is kind of like the important parts for our purposes here. Finally, the Act created something called the National Historic Preservation Fund, and that was done to assist financially in running and administering all these programs. So I'm not going to go into everything about DAHP. There's way too much to say. I'm just going to do a kind of a quick overview. DAHP is a really small state agency. There are a few archaeologists on staff. A few of them specialize in transportation projects. There's a team of historic preservationists. We call ourselves the Built Environment Unit. I'm part of that Built Environment Unit. We also have a couple of anthropologists on staff. We even have a human remains lab in our office. Very interesting. So basically, if it's old and special in our state, if it's below ground or above ground, DAHP works to protect it either through education or regulatory means. And these follow, we follow state and federal law. That beautiful building on your screen is the old courthouse in Olympia. That's where DAHP is housed. If you ever drive by it, that's where we are. We're located down in the basement. I think that's pretty fitting, actually. And so heading up DAHP is Allison Brooks. She's the State Historic Preservation Officer, and Nicholas Van, and he's the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. Again, this just kind of scratches the surface of DAHP, but just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. Okay. So currently there are just over 60 certified local governments, or CLGs, in Washington state. So being a certified local government simply means that your local historic preservation program is certified by the National Park Service. So certified local government, certified by the National Park Service. It's not required by state or federal law or anything that a community become a CLG. A lot of communities have preservation programs and commissions without being a CLG. That's totally fine. Your community opted to join the CLG program because it offers technical and financial benefits. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, more specifically. But for now, know that being a CLG or a certified local government, it basically means that your community is in a partnership with the National Park Service at the federal level and DAHP at the state level. Okay, a really important subject that I want to tackle right off the bat. So being listed on the National Register of Historic Places or the Washington State Heritage Register does not and cannot protect buildings from alterations or even demolition. This is one of the top misconceptions about historic preservation. This is a question I get all the time. People are usually very surprised by this. The National Register, the State Register does not have anything in place that protects historic buildings. Listing a property on the National or State Register, it's an honorary thing. It's an honorary thing only. Think of the National and Washington State Registers as simply lists that recognized a historic property's importance to its community, the state, or the nation. It's a list. Putting a property listed on the National or State Register does not legally impose any type of regulatory or design review on the property owner. Neither the federal government or DAHP or the local commission has any power to review work or prevent alterations or demolition to buildings listed on the National or State Registers. Right. The only power your commission has to review changes to historic buildings is if the building has been added to your local historic register with owner consent and following the process that is laid out in your local historic preservation ordinance. So properties on your local register, they can also definitely be on the National and State Register, but they must also be listed locally for you to do a design review, right? Like the National Register, the State Register, they're completely different things than, that anything that has to do with what we're doing locally. So think of it like this. So if you're a property owner and you agree to be listed on the National or State Register, right, and you're told correctly that it's just an honorary listing, there's no regulations attached to it, right? Great, you go through, you get your home or your business building that you own on the National Register of Historic Places, great. But then your local preservation commission comes in and just automatically adds you to the local register without your consent. They don't follow any of the processes in the local ordinance for adding your property to the local register. So now all of a sudden you're subject to design review if you want to make changes to your property, design review from the local preservation commission. I don't think that you'd probably want to list your building or another property on the National or State Register after that. So I'm not trying to be a downer by saying this at all. I'm not trying to be negative. I just want you to understand that process. Knowledge is power. The more accurate information you're armed with, the better. So just like you, I obviously wish there were better state and federal laws to protect historic buildings. But for where we are right now, we've got to know, what the laws are, and we've got to work with things as they are currently. So remember that I said that the National Historic Preservation Act was amended in 1980 to require that each state historic preservation office establish a certified local government program. So why did that even happen? This was directly due to there being so little effective protections or laws for historic buildings at the federal and state levels, what we were just talking about, right? So Washington State, like most states, is a home rule state. So home rule is something that's granted by state constitution or state statute. It allocates some autonomy to local governments. So preservationists realized that given the weak state and federal laws, we could use this to our advantage. So in home rule states, local governments can do things like create their own historic preservation ordinance, and that gives them some local powers and processes to help protect their historic properties. Now we might think of as the National Register or the Washington State Heritage Register. Those might sound, really powerful and fancy. In reality, the power lies with something like the Hoquiam Register of Historic Places. That's actually, the register that you want to be on if you're trying to protect something local. That your local register is always more powerful. So I can't stress enough how important it is to read your ordinance. All of this stuff is contained within your local historic preservation ordinance. Um, if you don't have access to your ordinance, if you don't know where it is, if you haven't read it before, that's totally fine. You can email me, ask me, I will show you exactly exactly where to find it. When you became a CLG, your ordinance was probably created from a template that came from DAHP. And the template would have included language that gave you certain powers in your ordinance, in order for your ordinance to have been approved by the National Park Service. So at a minimum, your ordinance will give your community the power to create that local historic preservation commission. It'll give you the power to create your local register of historic places. It spells out the procedures for adding properties to your local register of historic places. It's your ordinance that gives you the power to review changes to properties on your local register, also known as design review. Your ordinance also adopted something called special tax valuation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, this is the stuff that would have just come with the template in your ordinance in order to just be approved as a certified local government by the National Park Service. Okay. Now, the things I just listed, like I said, they're the basic requirements. You all had to have that stuff in your ordinance when you became a CLG. However, a lot of you have more developed in-depth ordinances. That's totally fine. You're just required to have these kind of basic things in there, but a lot of CLGs have added stuff, right? As long as it kind of follows it doesn't violate any federal preservation laws or state historic preservation laws or local laws. That's totally fine. That's great. As much as you can get past at the local level into your ordinance, the better. So your ordinance might have language for creating a local historic district, or for creating design guidelines. You might have design guidelines that actually are in your historic preservation ordinance. They don't all look the same. All of your ordinances come from kind of a basic template, but they don't all look the same, and that's exactly how that's supposed to work. And just so you know, each of you has an ordinance that gives you either what is called quasi-judicial powers, and that's where the commission has the final say, or your ordinance gives you advisory powers. So when you have advisory powers, the Preservation Commission is limited to making recommendations, and usually you'll make recommendations like during a design review. Your recommendations will go to like a city building official or another department, usually like the planning department, something like that. But each community is different, but your ordinance will either say what your powers are or will have language that kind of alludes to it. And if you're confused about that when you read your ordinance, what the extent of your powers are, you can contact me. I know there are some things to kind of look for that give you clues about what extent your powers are in your ordinance. Okay. So get down about the limited powers of the national or state registers. Study your ordinance, know what's in them, take advantage of what's in them. That's where your power is. Oh, one more thing. When you were approved to become a CLG, you also would have created bylaws. A lot of your ordinances will refer to bylaws. They'll either call them bylaws or they'll call them rules. It's basically the same thing. Bylaws, rules are the same things. A lot of you don't have them. I know that even like at the city level, some of your commissions have been certified local governments for so many years that the bylaws are just gone. I have a lot of the original copies of them. So if you're having a hard time finding those, locating those, let me know. I can scan them and I can send them to you. Okay. So I said earlier that when your community decided to become a CLG, it did so because there are benefits to becoming a CLG. So being a CLG, it's basically a reciprocal relationship. So you use that power in your local ordinance, right? Because of home rule, you've got those powers at the local level to protect your historic buildings through design review. And the federal and state government in return offer you technical assistance and access to funding. So it's a give and take relationship. So if you remember, one of the things the National Historic Preservation Act did was establish the Historic Preservation Fund. So this is a federal fund. It's actually funded by revenue from offshore oil and gas leases. It's not, income tax or anything like that. So every year, the federal government is required to give a certain amount of money to every state historic preservation office. So my agency gets money every year to run the state historic preservation program, but we're also required, every state historic preservation office is required to use 10% of the money that they get to go towards certified local governments. We have to spend at least 10% on certified local governments. So these are competitive grants, and they're only open to preservation commissions that are CLGs. You are like I said, they're competitive, but you're way more likely than not to be awarded funding. For the last application cycle, it just closed last Friday, there was roughly $115,000 available. Requests were from $2,000 to $20,000. And for a lot of your communities, this might be the only source of preservation funding that's available to you. So take advantage of that. If you're a certified local government, you're, showing up to your commission meetings, you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing, you are entitled to apply for this money. So make sure that you're doing that. Take advantage of what you're entitled to. So every year, I send out a manual that outlines what funding can be used for. So the National Park Service actually has a bunch of requirements about what you can and can't use funding for. It's this giant manual that I have studied and studied and studied, and I can answer your questions about what is what you can use the funds for and what you can't. It's pretty wide open. Like, you can be really creative. I've been encouraging CLGs this year to be creative with their proposals, and the applications that I got last week were actually really creative. They were thinking outside the box. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. If you're interested, if you want to apply for these, let me know. I can help you come up with ideas for proposing for making a proposal for a CLG grant. So the second primary benefit of being a CLG is having direct technical assistance from DAHP. So that's exactly what we're doing with this training right now. Trainings like this are only open to certified local governments. I touched on this earlier. DAHP has a highly trained staff of archaeologists, historic preservationists, right? But think of me as your personal historic preservationist. I'm a real live person that can answer questions. Like I said, I could drive to your town, I could speak to your commission, I will speak to your community members, try to get them on board, maybe clear up some stuff about historic preservation, some misconceptions. Just call me. Again, that's your right, that's your entitlement as a certified local government. So I can not only help you understand your processes, all the processes in your ordinance. I can help you clarify everything kind of about the CLG program that you have questions about. But I can also do things like point you to technical assistance, financial resources, answer questions you have about historic building materials, alternative materials, identifying and understanding architectural styles. If I don't know the answer, I will help you find the answer. There's just a wealth of information that I have access to that I would love to provide you with. So finally, being a CLG means that your ordinance allows locally listed properties to become eligible for special tax valuation. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of special tax valuation before. It's one of the subjects people get confused about. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but remember, special tax valuation and financial incentives for preservation. It's one of those 4 trainings that I'm planning on doing annually. Okay, so I talked about some of the requirements that you had to meet to become a CLG, but I want to talk to you about what it takes to maintain your status as a CLG. So you first must maintain your historic preservation commission. So your CLG commissions, they're required to have no fewer than 5 members. This must include 2 professional members in certain disciplines. Those disciplines are things like architecture, architectural history, cultural anthropology, conservation. There's even something that says if you're a folklorist, you qualify as a professional member. So you're required to have two on your board or on your commission. But if you have difficulty filling any of those seats, or finding professionals, don't hesitate to reach out to me. People do all the time. You're not in trouble at all if you lose people, on your commission, or having trouble finding, somebody to fill those professional seats. A lot of you live in, small towns, and that can be really difficult. I will help you. We will work it out. There's lots of kind of alternatives and workarounds for that. So please just keep in mind. Another responsibility of the commission is to hold regular meetings. I know a lot of you do once a month. Washington state law says that at a minimum, you need to meet 4 times a year. I'm sure most of you do more than that. Commission meetings need to follow something called the Washington Open Public Meetings Act. If you don't know what that is, if you're like, what, I've never heard of that before, that's totally okay. Like I said, just get a hold of me. I'm going to have my information at the end of the meeting. I will point you to all the training. I will answer your questions. But just so you know, it's a requirement of your meetings. The commission should participate in the National Register review process. So no, I'm not contradicting what I said earlier. The commission is supposed to participate in the process to add buildings or districts to the National Register of Historic Places. You just don't review work that's done on buildings that are on the national or state registers, but adding them, great. Yes, you should have a say in that. You should be participating in that. You must keep an inventory of your local historic buildings. And it's also a really good idea to keep a list of stuff that you have added to your local register, somewhere that's really accessible. A lot of people will keep these on their city website. If you've got a historic preservation page, I think most of you do, for the city website, have a list of what's on the local register that you update, that people, can look at, can see what's there. It's not only interesting, but it's also, just good practice to kind of have that public. So in order to have an inventory of buildings or to list stuff on the register, you have to survey, right? You have to know what's there. You've got to add stuff to the local register, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And finally, you must perform design review to either approve or deny certificates of appropriateness or COAs when a property on the local register applies for a building permit. So this stuff is basically, all the stuff that your ordinance, that bare essential stuff that your ordinance had to have in it in order for you to become a CLG. You just have to continue to do that stuff in order to maintain your CLG status. So, have a commission, have meetings, have an inventory, do design review, right? All of those powers that came with your ordinance. So design reviews, in order to do design reviews, you're going to need to add stuff to your local register. You know that. I'm going to talk about design reviews a little bit more later. Okay, not required, but strongly advised. So the commission should understand how historic preservation fits into the overall broader picture of your community's planning efforts. So historic preservation may be part of your community's comprehensive plan. If that is true, you should know, and you should know exactly what the comprehensive plan says about your community's goals on historic preservation. You can apply for those annual CLG grant funds to hire a consultant to create a historic preservation plan for your community, or a historic preservation element for your comprehensive plan. That's one of the things that funding can be used for. Know that your local zoning ordinances have a lot to do with historic preservation and design related policies like setbacks and height limits. You should know that preservation policies and guidelines can sometimes conflict with zoning and building codes. One doesn't trump the other, but you got to find a way that those requirements can work together. Code officials usually have a certain amount of discretion, so it's a good idea to get to know them, make friends, so that when issues with historic things come up, they know you, they're willing to work with you, they want to work with you. There are sometimes exemptions and workarounds for zoning stuff for historic buildings. If you ever have questions about that, something that you're having a hard time figuring out locally, call DAHP. We can probably answer your question or point you to what you need to know. Okay, just reiterating, it's a perfect time to kind of talk about this. You catch more flies with honey. You all know this. Applies to relationships with city officials and community members, right? You want to be a good steward and a good representative of historic preservation. Part of doing that is reading your ordinance and knowing your ordinance. I know I keep harping on this, I keep saying that, but you really want to understand the rights and the powers and the processes of your Historic Preservation Commission. It can save you a lot of grief, especially when kind of local politics comes into play. Know what your before you comment on something. Know what your powers are from your ordinance. Okay, next topic. When you add properties to your local register, a good nomination form is essential. So remember that this is your one chance to record all the key historic features of the property. You will use this record when design review occurs on the property. Future commissioners will only have your documentation to refer to when making decisions in 20, 30, or 40 years. Be thorough. More information, if more information is warranted, request that it be added to the nomination. A good nomination form includes what specific criteria the property meets in order to qualify for inclusion on your local register. All of that criteria for being on the local register is, of course, in your ordinance. One of the wonderful things about being a CLG and having a local register is that your community has the ability to be much more inclusive for what buildings you add to the local register than the current national register requires for being on the National Register of Historic Places. So to become a CLG, you only had to adopt some criteria for being on the local register. Some communities just copy and paste the criteria that the National Register uses for adding stuff to the National Register, but yours might look a little bit different. That's okay. That's absolutely fine. And your nomination form, I kind of said this already, but you just really want to make sure that there's a thorough description of the building's original historic features. This is ultimately what you're trying to protect, those original historic features. Ask for a list in addition to the narrative of what those features are, if that helps you. Oh, and look at your ordinance too, because your ordinance will say, sometimes I've seen ordinances that say that the commission actually has the power to review stuff that's on the interior of the building. They're all a little bit different. If you've got a building that, has really amazing intact, historic woodwork or something, that might be something that actually got added to the local register nomination, which is one of the reasons, the woodwork was one of the factors that made the building eligible for the local register, right? That you can review it. If your ordinance says that you have the power to review it, but again, read your ordinance, find out what you can review. And again, never be afraid to ask for more information on a local register nomination form. Ask for photos if you can get them. That's awesome. Historic maps. Direct applicants to your local historical society if you have one. I know a lot of you have those contacts. Some people on the preservation commissions are also, on the members of the historical society or volunteers for the local historical society. Does your local historical society have a photo collection? DAHP's webpage has a bunch of information about researching the history of a building. This is when I'm going to send out some follow-up stuff. So just so you know, to people that attended, but that's one of the things I'm going to send you some information about researching historic buildings, where to look. So yeah. All right. And a final note on nominating properties to your local register. Your ordinance is there to give the commission its powers, but it is also there to keep it from being biased, to keep your commission in check. Unless your ordinance says Only grand buildings that the commission agrees are pretty and were built before 1930 are eligible for inclusion on the local register, then you're covered. That's fine. But your ordinance definitely does not say that. And the oldest building that I ever worked on was built in 1735. It was really cool. But I would also argue that every building that's on your screen is also really cool. It's interesting in its own ways, its own way. Buildings are more than just their aesthetics. They're giant artifacts. They tell the story of our past. We don't have to like them. We don't have to think that they're beautiful. The most interesting communities have a variety of styles from different periods. The intent of preservation is not to keep communities frozen in time. That's one of the bad raps that historic preservation gets. That's not the intent. We're not trying to keep everything frozen at a particular period in time. But it's our responsibility to keep a variety of stuff around for future generations. If you look at that building in the upper right, I think it's on the right-hand corner in your screen, building that's kind of brick on the top and in black on the bottom. That's an Italianate style commercial building. It was built in 1879. If you look obviously at the bottom of that building, it's got a modern storefront that was added around the 1950s. That storefront was added during a period where in the United States and abroad, there was kind of a craze for modernizing old buildings, right? I think the Italianate building, the original building, is really cool. And I think that the modernization, the modern storefront is also really cool. But I'm showing you this kind of just to make the point that whoever put on that modern storefront in the 1950s obviously didn't really, wasn't too fond of that Italianate building from 1879. They might have thought, God, that's old and outdated and ugly, and that's just not kind of, the image that, we want to present here, and that's hard for a lot of us to imagine that somebody could see that building from 1879 is not beautiful or, ugly, outdated. But what's aesthetically pleasing is kind of in the eye of the beholder, and it's not universal, it's not universally agreed on, and it changes. So, finally, by National Register standards, and probably all of your ordinances say this too, a building that is 50 years or older can be considered historic and added to the register, added to your local register, added to the National Register. 50 years ago was 1972. So do you have buildings that were built in the late 60s that were built in 1972 in your town? Could they be eligible for your local register, perhaps? Okay. So ultimately, you have a preservation commission. And there are CLGs because you want to protect and plan for your community's historic buildings. That's the whole purpose of having a CLG. If you remember, one of the responsibilities for being a CLG is that you survey an inventory to find out what historic resources you have in your town. It's hard to protect things when you don't have anything added to the local register. So if you haven't yet completed a survey of the historic properties in your town, you can get one of those annual CLG grants to do it. And you can hire a professional consultant that will come into your community and will do that for you. That survey report that the consultant would produce for you, it provides data that indicates, if you've got significant properties that could be either added to the national or local register, or maybe you've got a concentration of properties that could be, that could possibly make a local or a national register historic district. So if you haven't done a survey in a long time, definitely something to consider, and there is funding for it. Okay, wizard. DAHP uses, and that's how it's pronounced too. I've heard it pronounced wizard in different ways, but it's wizard, W-I-S-A-A-R-D. DAHP uses this massive online database called Wizard. This is where we store all the data collected from those historic, those inventory surveys I was just talking about. Wizard stores all kinds of other information too. There's lots of archaeological sites. A lot of that is kind of restricted information. The person at your local contact for your certified local government program should have access to, at least a basic access to Wizard. All of the consultants that do work, that do those surveys and stuff, they have access to Wizard. This is where they enter information. So touched on this just I kind of went over this a second ago, but Wizard keeps everything. Anything that's ever been surveyed, it just all goes into Wizard. But we don't keep in Wizard what stuff is listed on your local register. So again, just reiterating that we don't know that at DAHP. We don't have a record of that. So it's a really good idea to make sure that you've got an updated, clear, accessible record of that you've actually listed on your local register, or if you have any local register districts, anything like that. Because we'll have national register districts are listed on Wizard, but your local districts won't be. All right, let's talk design review. All right, you will want to have two key things in front of you when you're completing a design review. Your well-detailed local register nomination form for the building, any plans, drawings, whatever for the proposed work, the proposed changes on the building, and a copy of your commission's design review criteria. So when you became a CLG, your ordinance required, one of the things that your ordinance required was that you have some language in there that spelled out what criteria specifically you were going to use when you do a design review of a building that is on your local register. It's really, really, really crucial that you know what that criteria is. Commission members should memorize the criteria if you can. It's something you really kind of want to know backwards and forwards. This is not only, like I said, your ordinance, and it's not only what gives you powers, that it also has things in it that keep the commission from being unbiased or from being fair, right? It keeps to keep it fair. It keeps your powers in check. So design review should follow whatever criteria you have. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But it shouldn't be based on personal feelings. It should never be based on your personal feelings. Design review isn't arbitrary. So, if commission members say something like, I don't like that color, or I don't want another hair salon downtown, that doesn't have any place in the comments coming from the Historic Preservation Commission or your board. You really need to be following what's in your design review criteria. So some of you have, in addition to design review criteria, some of you have what are called design guidelines, and these should be referred to. They're probably in your ordinance. They've been adopted by city code. Design guidelines are usually they're sometimes created by certified local governments themselves. The commissions will create them themselves, but sometimes or often consultants will be hired to prepare them, and they prepare them for a local historic district in your community. And you think about it, every historic district kind of has its own flavor. It's got its own kind of character. So design guidelines go kind of really deep into making recommendations for specific local historic districts. If you have them, this is another thing you want to just make really sure to know if you have any of these design guidelines. And another thing that I can help you with, or I can help you locate where they are in your city code. Okay. Oh, one more thing that I want to tell you about design review. This actually came up recently. Somebody asked me this. Some commissions opt to do a preliminary review with the property owner before the proposed work on a locally listed building goes before your committee for a formal design review. So this still must be something that's done at a public meeting. This isn't, over coffee or whatever it needs to be, in the public. It needs to be done at a public meeting, but it's more conversational, kind of a back and forth, like, have you done this? Like this, you're helping them prepare so that they have the best chance possible of getting through the design review, right? So there's no fee for this, it's nothing like that. It's not that formal. You're just making sure, partially that you're keeping good relationships, with the people that are proposing work on their locally listed buildings. But it's a good thing to keep in mind doing a preliminary review. Okay, we're getting near the end. Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. When I mentioned a moment ago that you all have some kind of design review criteria that was adopted in your ordinance that you need to follow. most CLGs adopted something called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for rehabilitation. You might just see in your ordinance that it says just the Secretary of the Interior Standards are your design review criteria. It may just refer to them that way. It might not list them out. Some of your ordinances will say that your criteria for design review is in your bylaws or it's in your rules. And like I said, a lot of CLGs have lost their bylaws or their rules over time. I have original copies of most of them, so let me know. But something you really kind of want to get your hands on. But on your screen, these are the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. They're basically a set of 10 historic preservation best practices issued by the National Park Service. You should read them, of course, but remember your design review criteria, it might be slightly different, or you might have design guidelines. Anyway, Secretary of the Interior standards, this is what it's referring to if you see these in your ordinance. Okay, local historic districts. Some of you have them, and some of you are thinking about establishing one. That's excellent. Local districts are probably the best tool available for protecting your community's historic buildings. Especially if you adopt some of those design guidelines, right, that are specific to that local district. That's even better. Keeping with our mantra that preservation is most powerful at the local level, the same is true of local historic districts. So you remember that your commission does not have the authority to review buildings individually listed on the national or state registers. But of course, yes, your commission absolutely does have the power and should be reviewing, doing design review on things that are listed on your local register. It works the same thing with historic districts. Your commission can't review buildings that are in a national historic district. DAHP can't do that either, right? It's not just you, DAHP can't do it either. But if you have a local historic district, you most certainly can, and you most certainly should review buildings in your local district. Careful. This is one of the things that I've seen a few times. I'm not calling anybody out. And I don't think anybody here has done this, but if you get a national register district, great, it goes through, it's approved, you've got a national register district in your town, don't just slap a local historic district on top of it, and just say, okay, those are the boundaries. Now we've got a local historic district. There should be a process laid out in your ordinance that requires owner participation in the process of creating a historic district. This is a democratic process. Your ordinance should spell out things like, what to do if a property owner doesn't respond in favor or against the district. Does that mean that they're for it or they're against it? A lot of you probably don't have this language in your ordinance. It's one of those kind of additional things that you have the option to add to your ordinance. But if you don't, and you would like to potentially think about having a local district, let me know. I will help you with the language for adding that language to your ordinance. So remember that with individual listings to the local register, owner consent is required. We never just decide that somebody's on the local register and, surprise, now you're on the local register and you're going through design review. The owner needs to consent to being on the register. It's just the way it is. I've never seen an ordinance that says that 100% of the property owners in the proposed local district have to say yes to it. If that were the case, we would never get a local district. Nobody's going to 100% agree to this. So this is the time where it means that you could have people in a local historic district who voted against it or did not want to be in a local historic district, and your commission could potentially have to do a design review for somebody that did not want to be in a local historic district. So this is part of the reason why it's really important to go through that democratic process when you're creating a local design review. People need to have the ability to participate, even if ultimately, the people that didn't want to be in the local district, they didn't want a local district created, even if, it turns out that you got a local district and now they're in it, at least they had the opportunity to voice their opinions. And you can use CLG grant funding to hire consultants to help you create a local register district and even a national register district. Okay, special tax valuation. I said I would talk about this a little bit. This was passed into state law. So this is Washington state law in 1985. So the reason that special tax valuation exists in the first place, it started as an incentive for owners of dilapidated historic buildings who do not want to put money into fixing up those buildings because they're afraid with improved property value comes higher property taxes, right? So I unfortunately think we're probably all familiar with this situation. So there's a formula for how special valuation works. I'm not gonna cover that right now. But basically, owners of historic buildings, they put money into their building. If they're approved for special tax valuation, their property taxes will not increase nearly as much as they would have without receiving special tax valuation for an entire decade. So for a period of 10 years. So, hold on a second here. Okay. And there was also a law recently, there was an amendment to the special tax valuation law recently that added 2 7-year extensions for buildings receiving special tax valuation in towns that are under 20,000 people and are located in an economically distressed county. In order to qualify for special tax valuation, the building needs to be listed on the local register. So your ordinance talks about special tax valuation. You had to adopt something in your ordinance that says that buildings on your local register will be eligible for special tax valuation. The work on the building needs to be completed within a 24-month period prior to the building owner applying for special tax valuation. Not all work on the building is going to qualify for special tax valuation, but the work on the building needs to follow your design review criteria. So since special tax valuation is only available to buildings that are listed on the local register, that means that when the person put in a permit for work on the building, it should have triggered a design review, when they started the work. So, hopefully, 2 years ago or whatever, if it was a 24-month period. So your commission actually was able to meet with them and, give them their advice or their decisions or whatever, so that the person is following the local design criteria on the work they're doing for special tax valuation. So really quickly, how this works, and a lot of people are confused by special tax valuation in general. The applicant submits the application to the county assessor. Like I said, within 24-month period of doing the work, assessor reviews the application. They make sure, all the receipts are in, they kind of do the financials. They make sure that the application is filled out correctly, all of that stuff. And then the assessor sends it to the preservation committee. And so since the assessor can't be expected to know, what's right for a historic building, know anything about brick or, that kind of thing, it's the CLG, the Historic Preservation Commission's responsibility to make sure that the work was in line with the design review criteria. So, we don't want to give people money for doing whatever they want to just because the building is old, right? We want to make sure that they took the design criteria, the Secretary of the Interior standards, whatever you're using, that they followed that when they were doing work on the building. Okay. All right. A thing I want you to know about is federal historic tax credits. This is not really a local government thing, but it's something that I want you to have. It's something that I want you to have in your toolbox. It's a really common, it's one of the big financial incentives for historic buildings. Federal historic tax credits, this is something that we do at DAHP too. So contact us if you want to find out more about this. I'll direct you to exactly who you need to talk to. Federal historic tax credits are available to buildings that are on the National Register of Historic Places, or that are what's called contributing in a National Register district. I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but this is a National Register thing. So like I said, nobody can review stuff that happens to buildings on the National Register just because, you can do whatever you want to with your National Register building. But if the federal government is giving you money to do work on your historic building, then the government can have some say in what you do. So when people get money through these federal historic tax credit or get a tax break through federal historic tax credits, they have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards on the work that they do on that historic building. So the building that you see on your screen is the Otis Hotel in Spokane. That's what it actually looked like when I lived there. And then you can see those pictures on the right. It's now the Hotel Indigo. There's the photo of the interior too. So it went from this vacant kind of rundown building to this beautiful boutique hotel. And you can tell by looking at the interior and the exterior, they were very sensitive to preservation. And they did the work, and that's because they received federal historic preservation tax credits. So, okay, real quick, I'm not going to go into all of these. I just want you guys to know that they're available. There are a lot of grants available for historic preservation. You need to ask. They might not always be available. They come in cycles. The four on your screen: theaters, courthouses, barns, and cemeteries. Those are just a few of the grants that we do at DAHP. If you're not sure, call us. Let us know. The Park Service, National Park Service, has grants a lot too that DAHP will choose people to receive. So if you're looking for funding, let us know. Call me. Okay, last piece of advice that I'm going to leave you with. These are two book recommendations on the screen. You'll see the one, I think it's on your left, The Politics of Historic Districts. If you have a historic district, a local historic district, or you're thinking about pursuing one, you should probably read that book. I would very much recommend The Politics of Historic Districts. It's pretty cheap on the internet. I think I've got a version on Kindle. And then the other one on the right, A Field Guide to American Houses. This is kind of like the book for architectural historians, historic preservationists. I have two copies. I have one in my car. I have one actually right next to me at my desk. This is it's chronological. It's got lots and lots of illustrations. This book is full of the actual, residential buildings that you actually find in your towns. There's some fancy stuff in here, but by and large, this is, all about the buildings that you're actually going to see in your town. If you want to learn more about historic buildings, as a commission member, walk around with this, use this as your tour guide, walk around town with it. So can't recommend that enough. A Field Guide to American Houses, Virginia McAllister. Okay, I'm gonna leave you with one more thing. The last thing I'm gonna leave you with. If you're looking, this is something I tell people all the time. If you're looking for really good examples of how another CLG does something, I would have you look to Spokane. There are a lot of you that do really great things, and I don't know, all of what everybody has, but the person that is the historic preservation officer in Spokane has they're a CLG with a full-time historic preservation officer. She actually used to be in my position. So, if you're looking for information about how they did a local historic district or what their nomination form looks like for the local register, anything like that, I would just get on Spokane's website for their certified local government and see what they're doing. So